Piaget's theory of cognitive development. It is a very important step in understanding child psychology because it explains how a child constructs a mental model of the world he or she is living in. Why is there a need for Piaget's theory? Why was there a need for Piaget's theory back in 1936? There was a need because children were actually looked at as they were miniature version of adults, and therefore it was difficult to understand how a child actually looked at the world around him or her. Piaget's theory emphasized that children don't actually start learning and perceiving things as adults. They aren't actually smaller version of adults, and they go through 4 specific stages of mental development and gradually develop mental abilities and eventually start looking at the world around us in the same way as adults do. So let's take a look at the stages of cognitive development. It's important to note that these stages here are arranged in the form of an arrow. It could very easily have been arranged as stairs or steps, because there's no concrete way of arranging these 4 stages. They just happen one after the other, as is evident from the picture. So the first stage that a child goes through is sensory motor, which happens between 0 to 2 years, and then there's the pre-operational stage, which happens between 2 to 7 years, and then there is a concrete operational stage, which happens between 7 and 11 years, and then there is a formal operational stage, which happens after year 12. So let's look at these stages one after the other. The first stage is the sensory motor stage, which happens between 0 and 2 years. So a good way of remembering this stage is firstly picture a child of 0 to 2 years in your mind and understand that the child would actually look at things just with the view of holding them, just looking at them and putting them in their mouth. That's what children do. And these are basically motor senses, which are sight, sound, touch, smell, taste, etc. Basic motor senses, and that's all the child actually realizes to use at this stage. So sensory refers to motor senses, and this is the stage where all of the sensory motor skills, senses, are used by the child to explore the world around him or her. So children in this stage realize that they are different to the inanimate objects around them, gradually of course, not when a child is a few months old, but gradually in this stage they realize that they are actually different. They have an individual existence. They start learning, this is very important, they start learning that things can exist even if they don't see them, which is called object permanence. This is a very important concept because this is one of the most important developments that happen in this stage. Object permanence basically refers to the notion that an object will still exist if it's not present in front of their eyes. For instance, if it's a very young child who requires a certain type of ball, and if it's taken away from him and put away in a place where he or she can't see it, then he or she would think that the object no longer exists. But gradually, as the child progresses along in this stage, he or she realizes that the object still exists, but it's just away from his eyesight, from his field of vision. So that is called object permanence, and that is developed in this stage. They also learn to start experimenting with trial and error to get attention. So this is something that anyone who has experienced life living with a toddler would understand, that they start experimenting, they start analyzing, observing patterns wherein their demands are met once a certain behavioral pattern is followed. So they would continue following these behavior patterns to get their demands met at this stage. Piaget actually divided this stage into various sub-stages, which which actually explain the same thing in greater detail, so we're not going to go into those sub-stages of this video. We're going to move on to the next stage, which is the pre-operational stage, which is from 2 to 7 years. The hallmark, the primary development in this stage is language. Children now also start using words and pictures to represent objects. For instance, they understand that dressing up as a doctor, they can see the world as a doctor, so they understand role play. They understand that certain pictures and words can actually represent objects. Children start to think about themselves more, and basically at some point think about themselves as being the center of the universe, which Piaget coined a word for called ecocentric. So Piaget believed that children at this stage become very egocentric, and they rarely understand things from another person's point of view. For instance, a good example is if a child is watching TV with you, he or she would stand right in front of you at times and watch the TV and would not understand that he or she is actually blocking your view of the television. So long as the child can see it, they believe that it's visible for absolutely everybody. So that is just a one view of the world, and that's their own at this stage. So moving on to the next stage, which is called concrete operational, which goes on from 7 to 11 years. The main aspect of this stage is the development of logical reasoning. So through the course of this stage, logical reasoning is developed in the minds of the child. Instead of being egocentric, they are now socio-centric, wherein they actually observe other people's viewpoints and actually understand most of them and the differences between their viewpoints and the viewpoints of others. Another important concept here is conservation. So basically, if a child in the pre-operational stage gets an object broken into several pieces, like a piece of candy, he or she wouldn't understand that some of these pieces would actually still be the same candy. In this age, however, the child understands that if a candy is broken into multiple pieces, all of the pieces together would be the same candy. That's conservation. Reversibility is another interesting concept understood in this, learned in this stage, and it refers to the understanding that many objects can be changed and returned to their original conditions. As an example, we can consider an inflatable ball. When an inflatable ball is deflated, a child in this stage would understand that the ball can be inflated again and it will still be the same ball. It's not a different object anymore. It's still the same object. Moving on to the next stage, which is the formal operational stage. This occurs beyond 12 years of age. Now at this stage, abstract thought and hypothetical thinking emerges in the young adult, as we would say. Can't refer to a 12-year-old as a child, I suppose. What does abstract thought and hypothetical meaning mean? What does it refer to? For instance, if a child in the concrete operational stage is asked to, just as in a hypothetical sense, is asked that if you have a third eye, where would you actually place it? More often than not, a child in the concrete operational stage would actually say that he or she would like to place the third eye right in between the two eyes. Perhaps that's because it's easy and it just looks cool. But in a formal operational stage, a child is more likely to actually place the third eye in a place where it actually serves a purpose. For instance, at the back of the neck, because it would actually give you extra vision at the back, or on one of your hands, so that you can reach out to corners and actually see things. So these are the differences in approaches that young adults have, as opposed to a child in a concrete operational or pre-operational stage. At this stage, young adults start thinking about eventual consequences of their actions. So they realize that their actions can have far-reaching consequences at this stage. They also develop problem-solving skills without trial and error. For instance, if you ask a child in the concrete or the pre-operational stage, I would say concrete operational, because this experiment is probably too advanced for the pre-operational stage anyway. So if you ask a child in a concrete operational stage to balance a set of weights, a bar with a couple of weights on each side and several other weights to pile on, to balance it, the child wouldn't understand, unless they use trial and error, how to actually balance the barbell. There are several aspects ranging from actually arranging the same amount of weight both sides and actually holding the bar right at the center. And the whole process is not understandable for a child during the concrete operational stage. But in the formal operational stage, without a trial and error procedure, a young adult is able to actually understand this sort of a problem-solving equation or a situation, and is actually able to use his or her mental powers to actually solve a problem of this type. And various other mental operations can actually be performed without needing physical assists. Like mathematical problems, the level of mathematical problems that a young adult can solve at this stage is very much more enhanced as opposed to the concrete operational stage. So, a very popular theory, Piaget's theory of cognitive development, laid a foundation in various ways, but there are various criticisms to it. Firstly, children often acquire these skills a lot sooner than Piaget actually concluded in his theory. It is observed by various people and various groups after a lot of studies being conducted that a lot of children actually tend to develop various skills at different time periods, and it's not as concrete, it's not as specific as Piaget tended to believe. And also another very important criticism for the theory of cognitive development is that it doesn't take any external factors and circumstances into consideration. For instance, a child belonging to a lower section of the society, a poorer section of the society, will definitely not have the level of exposure that a wealthy child would have, for instance. So the learning would be completely different in both of these situations, and such an external but very important circumstance is not taken into consideration by Piaget. And also, one of the things that Piaget really focused on was how ecocentric children are in the pre-operational stage, that is between 2 and 7 years, which is not actually the case. It is highly debated that children at the pre-operational stage are not half as egocentric as Piaget tended to believe. They are still capable of understanding other people's point of view, and are still a lot more developed or a lot more sophisticated than Piaget believed.